Hey there, folks. This is Screen Watching. My name's Dan Barrett, joined by Simon Foster. Premise of this podcast is simple. We watch the TV shows, we review the movies. Now, usually at this point of the podcast, I will list out the movies and TV shows we're going to review. But, folks, hold tight. We've got some other business to get to first. Okay, during the week, I published to an app called Blue Sky the top 10 greatest screen dogs in Australian screen history. Okay, here's what I call the definitive list. If you've got another dog you want to throw into the list, irrelevant, this is the definitive list. Simon Foster, are you prepared for this list?
I am prepared. Yeah, just bear with me 1 second. I'm just updating my Oscar predictions. Yes, okay, go ahead with your list.
Sorry, I thought you were putting on a pair of those glasses with like the whites and the little black dot to simulate that you're still awake.
Yeah, no, I'm right here for you. I'm keen to see how you get to 10. I can rattle off maybe 2 or 3, but hey, go for it.
You said that right before the podcast, hence why I'm doing it on the podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so watch where I do a bit of a cheat to get to 10. Okay, strap yourself in. This is the 10 greatest screen dogs at a definitive list.
Count them down. Don't go from 10 to 1.
Yeah, 10 to 1. Number 10, Bob Morrison from The Bob Morrison Show.
Valid. Yes.
It's not. Okay, Charlie the Wonder Dog.
What's that from?
From The Late Show, they used to do a piss take
Yes, they
of,
did.
yeah, like 80s kids TV.
That's cute. That's funny. Yeah, God, these are names I haven't heard in a long time. Okay, yes, Charlie the Wonder Dog, 9. 8.
8, Chili from Bluey. That's the mom.
Nice.
Yep.
Ooh, I hope. Is this going to be like a whole bunch of Bluey characters?
I did say there was a cheat, Simon. I said there was a cheat.
I've stumbled on your...
That's how a man gets to 10.
Okay, all right. 7.
7, Bouncer from Neighbours.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Number 6, Red Dog.
Yes, fine,
Yep.
big screen dog. Opposite was of Josh Lucas and Red Dog. Red Dog was the better actor.
I will say Red Dog's the only movie dog in here, which maybe speaks to the fact that Australian cinema has let us down on the dog stakes as far as...
We just had Runt at the cinemas, which took upwards of $3 million, so maybe your little small screen bias has kicked in here. No, we've got a long and cherished history. What about...
No, Simon, I'm not saying there aren't dogs on there. I'm saying over the ones made the list. Runt. Nobody cared about Runt. Who's
A lot
talking
of people
about Runt?
cared about it.
Come on,
Runt
I'm
was
walking
a big hit.
down the streets and all I'm hearing is, have you seen Runt?
Hey.
Everyone can't stop talking about Runt, Simon.
If you're going to dip into your little listicles, you got to get it right. But anyway, go ahead. Number 6. Or was that number 6? Number 5.
4 of my dogs here are from the most popular TV show in the world, Simon, so you think about that.
Yeah, okay.
Here we are getting out the big dog of them all, Wilfred.
Also, kind of a cheat, but I get it. All right, no, we'll go with that.
Is he not a dog?
Well, he's dog-ish, but he's kind of also human.
Just because he rips a few bongs here and there doesn't necessarily make him human, Simon.
Certainly doesn't make him dog. But anyway, go on.
Number 4, Bluey. Number 3, Bluey's sister, Bingo.
Here we go.
Number 2, Colin from Accounts.
Okay, timely, yes.
And number 1, Bandit, the father, the patriarch of the Bluey family.
So you went with the patriarch of the Bluey family over the character upon which the show is named and based.
It's true, much in the same way that if people list out their favourite characters from Seinfeld, the character of Jerry Seinfeld is always at number 3 on the list.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point too. I won't argue with that. Wow, look at you writing lists and then being able to hashtag Bluey and getting all that traffic. That is just good podcast publishing and website publishing. I'm very happy for you.
You think about that as you attach that to our socials. Now, Simon, it's important that we talk through... I regret nothing from that segment. Okay, it's important we talk about the titles that we're getting through this week. Big week at the movies. You're going to have a chat about September 5 at length. You're also going to dip into a little bit talking about Presence, which is a new Steven Soderbergh film, and You're Cordially Invited, which is the most star-heavy of the films, but it's an Amazon Prime Video release from last week. I am going to talk about a new Netflix series called CIDER VINEGAR. It's the Australian drama looking at the world of Belle Gibson and social media influencers. It's substantial. I'm also going to take a look at 2 TV shows called St. Denis, which is debuting this week on 7+ in Australia. It's about 10 episodes in the US. And The Hunting Party, which is a proper new US show, which is also debuting this week on 7+. That's what we're getting through. Let's roll the opening titles, and then we're going to get into the reviews.
This is not like TV, only better.
Television! Teacher! Mother!
Secret lover.
What, that's it? That's your movie?
Well, I said that I had an idea for a movie.
Okay, folks, I've just gotten home from dropping out some icy cold cans of Coke from the Black Thunder. This is the Screen Watching Podcast. My name's Dan Barrett, joined by Simon Foster, who has accused me in the past of being, quote unquote, a Bit FM radio there. Simon, I'm going to trust that you're well, and I'm going to ask you, September 5, what's it about? But before we hear that, let's watch the clip.
Ready, camera one. Hit it.
Good morning, I'm Jim McKay speaking to you live from the Olympics in Munich, West Germany.
Talk me through the day.
Starts with volleyball, then there's boxing.
Good. It's America versus Cuba.
Sure you want to bring in the politics?
It's not about politics. It's about emotions.
And we're clear.
Great job, everyone.
Do you hear that?
Close gunshots.
September 5 is a significant date in modern history. It was the day in which Palestinian terrorists seized athletes, Israeli athletes, at the Munich Games. They were meant to be the Happy Games, as they were labelled at the time, coming off the, a period in history that was particularly turbulent. This was to be the Olympic Games that helped smooth over some of the social discord and some of the political turmoil and military action that had gone before it.
Sorry, can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is set in, it's the real world event that took place in 1972. So this is Germany having the Olympics after a little skirmish called World War II. You might have heard of it. There's a few movies about it. Okay, so this is really just 27 years after World War II. And so Germany's doing that. And I kind of feel, as someone who came certainly after the fact, and so this is certainly, well in my past by 8 years. Okay, but it's forever ago. I sort of grew up thinking that this took place sort of, years and years and years after World War II, but it wasn't. It's just 27 years. So when you think about those sort of online conversational points you see every so often saying, we're now further away from 1985 than Marty McFly was from 1955 when you travel back in time. Okay, just think about, we don't think it's been that long since Back to the Future came out, but just think this is an even shorter time period. That's the actual tension and cultural import of these games, it's really here on the screen in this film. I'm sorry to interrupt, I just kind of wanted to break out it was such a short time period.
It's an absolutely valid point, and one that I have in my notes here to mention, when the German press agent in this film and when the German government officials start talking of what a sad event this was, because it was only 27 years after the end of the Second World War and
Simon,
Germany's heinous role in that.
I've watched episodes more recent, a longer time period than this, of watching, say, Spin City than there was between World War II and this taking place.
Yeah, exactly right. So there is it was important to the German people and to the German government that the Munich Games did go off without a hitch, that the label, the Happy Games, came true. And that came crumbling down when the terrorist action took place. Now, that happens not so much in the background of this film, but it's all covered by the TV cameras of the sports team that are there from the American sports broadcasting team that are covering the Olympic Games. And what we have here is very much a moral struggle with the team of broadcasters who are locked in their very ancient-looking broadcast room and the action that's going on out in not only on the track but also in with the hostages. John Magara, who I know you're a big fan of, he plays a young and ambitious producer, Jeff, who's right on the brink of breaking big in the world of television. He's working with Rune Arledge, played by Peter Sarsgaard, who's a legendary TV producer who absolutely cottons on to this being an opportunity for him to have his big moment in the spotlight. Sarsgaard doesn't overplay that element. There is a lot of struggle within the group of people who are charged with bringing this coverage to the world stage, but Rune Eldridge certainly is someone who feels he can make a name for himself with this coverage. You also have Marvin Bader, played by Ben Chaplin, as sort of the third wheel in this cog, who are trying to argue with themselves as to whether broadcasting this moment in history carries with it the sort of importance and the weight that it ultimately does. Also in amongst that helm is a German interpreter called Marianne, played by by Leonie Benich, who was fantastic in the Teacher's Lounge a year or so ago. She has some of the most tense scenes in this film. We often talk about what it would be like to have those great old smart journalistic stories up on the screen again. It's no secret to listeners of this podcast that my favourite films are All the President's Men, Warren Beatty's Reds, films that look at the heroic nature and the moral nature of journalisms in trying times.
Ski School 2.
And Ski School 2. And this is certainly in that mould. September 5, I think, is a great film. It has copped a little bit of flack for focusing almost solely on the dilemmas that the Americans face in bringing this coverage to the world at a time when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still front and centre of the news, and when has it never not been? This movie doesn't weigh in on the timeliness of the events that took place, but maybe that's a different film. That's another film to be told in a different way. This one looks at a very specific point in time and the men and women who are central to that, and it achieves exactly what it needs to achieve in that regard.
Yeah, so I think that is a very different movie, and if you want to see that, go and check out and, criticise if need be films like Munich, for example, which look much more at the actual specifics of the hostage situation that took place. What this is a film which is questioning journalistic ethics and the right of journalists to report on and broadcast very specific events. And that's really what its focus is. It actually really isn't interested at all in the politics of the hostage situation as it stood. Instead, it really is looking at it's interrogating this idea of should journalists necessarily be there to pry into other people's business and report stuff to families in a live TV scenario. So it's not actually even just about the reporting. It's actually much more about, does the world need to see something take place live? And the reason why... Okay, if you jump on Letterboxd right now, you'll see lots of criticism of this movie, okay, only because of, I can't believe this has come out now and it's not actually, showing the plights of people from Palestine and talking about the politics of it, okay? But the thing is, that's not what this movie is, and the reason why this movie is set around that hostage situation with Black September is purely because this is the most, I think, sort of pure and distilled version, if you want to be able to talk about this from a journalistic ethics perspective, well, a live TV journalistic ethics perspective. Okay, this is one of the first times that you're really seeing news like this go out live. Okay, they're making up how to do this coverage at the time. The people reporting on it aren't actual professional journalists. They're sports journalists, and let me get letters back from all the,
You're going to get letters.
Yeah, from the 3 people still employed in that room. But, these are sports guys. They're not actually trained talking about, they don't consider, I guess, maybe the sort of ethics of TV news as deeply as someone who's actually in the trenches, day after day.
Which is the audience's endpoint as well. We're sort of struggling with it as they're struggling with it as well. And
absolutely. And as they start making mistakes, you're like, oh, wait, no, I actually understand why news is constructed in the way that it is and why sometimes these barriers are in place. But on the flip side as well, in this era that we're in right now, where a lot of the old school ideas as to what was permissible in terms of presenting information to the public and keeping information from the public, okay, as we're starting to reconsider a lot of that and who those gatekeepers are, okay, this becomes a really relevant conversation in this day and age of the influencer, okay, as, the newsmaker.
So why was it so ignored by the studio that released it and the audience who had an opportunity to see it? Is it just because the timing was too tough, or is this sort of film, as much as I appreciated it on the big screen, is the audience now expecting to see this kind of film on the small screen?
Look, not at all. I think this is the kind of film, it's a very low budget movie. Most of this takes place within the confines of the ABC Sports Studios in Germany.
Lovingly recrafted. It looks great.
Yeah. It looks great. It really is. Most of this film's in, the corridors around the studio or in the studio itself. There's very few times they actually exit the studio. Okay, it's I think, $2.5 million budget. It's a very small budget film. But I think this is, and you can see this from the cast. You look at people like Peter Sarsgaard, and no strangers to movies that make their way to the Academy Awards stage. Okay, this is absolutely there with the idea of, hey, if we can cut through and get some Oscar attention, okay, this is certainly the way he constructs movies to be able to do that. And this film almost made it over the line. It almost cut through to being part of that Oscar conversation. It's just, every year there's going to be, 10 slots effectively, and not every film can make it. But this was a conversation that was very much... It was a film that was in the conversation leading into its release.
And has earned an adapted a screenplay nomination as well. So it is in that very small mix. But yeah, it was a quality production.
You talked about the equipment in the film. Like, the equipment is all period-specific era. Yeah. Like, they've done the research on it. Everything in this is actually pretty authentic. They use a lot of the real footage that was recorded by the ABC Sports team at the time. Almost all the characters are effectively who were in the room then. Like, there's actually not a lot of wriggle room, with the exception of the young female, the only woman in this film, really. Journalist, or the translator, who kind of gets involved in the news reporting process, because they kind of just need her to facilitate a lot of that.
It's such a compelling...
Sorry, I just want to be clear. So she is a completely constructed character existing within this, but everyone else are real-life people.
The first half of this film, when they first hear the gunshots as the scale of the terrorist action starts to unfold, was absolutely tummy-tightening for me. Now, you make the point early on that this was like just a bit before your time in terms of the relevance. I remember the coverage of this and the overflow from this and the analysis of this being, it's 72, so I was 5 years old, so it's not like I was watching the news then. But as I became a young teenager and started reading Newsweek and Time and sort of started to pick up on world events, the shadow of this was still very much hanging over everyday news coverage and interpretations of it. So, I've always had an absolute fascination with this terrorist action and this sort of look at where the world was at this point in time. It is a pivotal point in time. Probably hasn't been looked at from this perspective in the past as to how the the journalists had to struggle with their own ethics and ambitions and roles in it. But the weight of what happened in Munich on this day is right up there on the screen on all of their faces.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a complete sucker for any movie that's about the media and construction of the media.
Oh, sure.
And this is absolutely what this is about. Like, this is chum in the water for me. So I come to this one with a fair bit of, my blinders are certainly on when I approach this film, but I had such a great time watching this movie. I think it is deeply interesting. I think the performances are incredible. Magaro delivers again. Man, that guy can do no wrong.
You love your Magaro.
Love Magaro.
You love Magaro.
He's a real
and
standout.
And Sarsgaard has never not done wrong.
No,
one of my
Sarsgaard's
favourite
always
movies.
Good.
What was the thing he did with Anakin Skywalker? The broken glass or shattered glass?
Shattered Glass. I actually watched that again, like maybe about a week or two ago.
It's just one of my favourite movies. Another great sort of journalism story. So Sarsgaard's at his best. And Chaplin, who I remember from his I Was the Cool sort of British kid import back in the 90s with Truth About Cats and Dogs and stuff like that. He is great as an older man and carries with him a lot of weight as this sort of old school television exec, Marvin Bader. So great cast.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I was watching Chaplin all the way through this and I could not work out who he was. Just because, the number of times I've seen Ben Chaplin on screen in like the last 10, 15 years, pretty limited.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But, he's fantastic in this.
He really was.
Something which is a bit of fun, which I think people can still find on Prime Video, was the US remake of Mad Dogs, which is about 4 guys who go on I think it's a bachelor's, holiday. Actually, are they bachelor? I don't think it is a bachelor's thing. I think they're just friends that are going on holiday at a friend's place in Belize, and then everything goes horribly wrong.
I don't know that.
It's very watchable and pretty fun in a very sort of dude-ish kind of a way.
With Ben Chaplin, you mean?
Ben Chaplin's in it. It's a cast. Okay. I just brought it up. It's Ben Chaplin, Michael Imperioli from The Sopranos and White Lotus Season 2. Romany Malco, who people would know maybe from Weeds. He's in The 40-Year-Old Virgin and was MC Scat Cat from the Paula Abdul video Opposites Attract.
That's where I know him from.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve Zahn is the other guy that's...
Check it out.
Anyway, fun cast.
All right, let's rock on to the big new Netflix release of the week, starring my girl Caitlin Devers. It's called Apple Cider Vinegar.
I'd like to welcome on the stage Belle Gibson.
It must have affected her that my book was reviewed as better than hers.
I'm sorry, who's her?
Miller.
She was diagnosed with cancer.
So she's consistently maintained. I have no reason to doubt her.
Because in her case, it's true.
So Simon, if you're Australian, we probably don't really need to go too much into what this is about specifically. What people probably need to know is this is a TV series recreation, a telling of the story of Belle Gibson, the social media influencer from the early 20s. She was one of the first social media influencers talking in that sort of health, wellness space. Much like a lot of people working in that space, complete grifter, and presenting a whole lot of information that has no medical bias whatsoever. When it comes from Belle Gibson's perspective, it's skewed a little bit more in that she was talking to her audience from the perspective of somebody that had more or less sort of beaten cancer, or was fighting, cancer, various elements of her life, and was beating it thanks to her, wellness routines. Okay, so what this does is it creates a situation where lots of people are literally going through the medical issues that she purported to have and taking what she has to say as being legitimate, which at no point ever was that true. As the real life Belle Gibson, there was, I guess, maybe an amplification of her voice as she got bigger and bigger. This is at a time period where, and look, if we're going to think about September 5 as being so shortly after the World War II, and how tight a time period that is, think about if we're looking at this at, say, 2010-ish. Okay, this is just 3 years after the iPhones come out, and lots of people are finding their way through a new app-based social media culture. So mistakes were made. There were big companies like Apple, for example, that just started highlighting Belle Gibson's app in the store, okay, with very little consideration given to, hey, wait, should this actually be there? Should we be amplifying her voice? These days, I think there'd be a lot more consideration given to that, if only for the PR issues that can take place as a result of, getting behind the wrong person. But back then, it was just such a new space that, as I said, mistakes were made. What this series does is looks at the rise of Belle Gibson as told in a social network ripping off style flashback. Okay, she's presenting herself to a possible PR flack that she wants to represent her after everything's gone terribly wrong. And so we're seeing the story sort of told through her eyes, but then also we're seeing the story of a rival wellness blogger who had fallen for all of this quite legitimately, but was also just sort of spreading bad information through her own social channels, and then how their lives entwined. Simon, you love Caitlin Devers.
I'm a huge Caitlin Devers fan. It started with Booksmart. She's done so much good work over the years. To watch her in this embrace the most subtle of Australian accents, what she does with her voice in this is perfect in capturing how the well-to-do young Australian female influencer speaks. She is just terrific. The rest of the cast work a treat. What I loved about the first couple of episodes which I've seen is that it takes the sort of flighty personality of Belle and turns it into, and uses that as a template for its style, for the way it presents itself, for its aesthetic. And the show itself reminded me of those true story retellings that have a bit of a sense of humour about them, stuff like The Big Short, or those sort of films that use humour, talk directly to the camera, have graphics.
Sorry, just going to interrupt briefly.
Yeah.
So there is obviously a mixture of real life people in this, some constructed characters as well, and to issue the disclaimer at the beginning, instead of a black title card saying, some of these characters works of fiction, yada, 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 they have the characters talk directly into the camera and offer that in a fairly sort of humorous way, which I think really adds to the vibe and overall tenor of this thing.
Yeah, so like 2 episodes in, I'm completely hooked by her performance, by the rest of the cast, especially Aisha D, who I think is on the cusp of big things going forward. And I'm really enjoying the very entertaining way in which it takes down her and her influencer culture while also making it a wildly entertaining show.
Yeah, so look, I'm not going to disagree at all with you in terms of saying that I think Caitlin Dever does an amazing Australian accent. I think she's actually fairly incredible in this program. And the cast is generally pretty solid as well. I think the writing's exceptionally strong through regular parts of this. The show, look, here's the thing. If there's any TV show at all, okay, which drops in, what's his name? Ashley Zuckerman into the cast, I'm immediately there for the program. I don't know what it is about Ashley Zuckerman, but I'm just immediately on board. I don't get it. It's like you and Caitlin Devers.
Which one's Ashley Zuckerman?
He's the guy that plays her husband.
Clive.
Not a husband partner, but yeah, Clive.
Yeah, Clive, who I say he is to Jake Gyllenhaal what Stephen Baldwin is to Alec Baldwin. He looks like a Gyllenhaal that goes a little off the rails, but you're right, he's terrific in this.
Yeah, he's like, remember when you were a kid and there were like those little sort of plastic things you'd put into the oven and they'd shrink down a little bit?
Twisty packets.
Yeah, he's one of those. Anyway, getting back to it. So I think the first episode of this absolutely flies along at a cracking pace and it's hugely entertaining. When they try giving the show a little bit of additional like room to breathe in the second episode, that's when I think the show starts to show some of its flaws. I don't know there's quite enough story to justify the 6-episode running time on it. And if you think about that second episode with her hanging out in her house as the PR guys come by and like they're doing a bunch of coke, and it's just getting a little bit sort of, I guess, silly. Like, I think there's a way to truncate a lot of that, and the series gets a little bit flabby at times to meet that 6-episode runtime. It probably would have been a little bit tighter as a 4-episode, leave the audience wanting more, I say. But the other thing that's literally a real problem that I have with this is I don't understand why they've hired Caitlin Dever to be the lead in this. Yes, she's very good in it, but I don't understand from a perspective where broadly, we want to see more Australian productions. We want to see Australian productions that reflect Australian culture, our stories, and for us to be able to tell our stories. I really hate the thing that's happened in Australian TV and certainly in movies, you know, going back to the 70s and 60s, where in order to get the funding, you get an American star or British actor occasionally to come in and be like the lead in a series. Like, I love Ben Feldman, for example, but I didn't need to see Stan investing in a TV series set in Australia with Ben Feldman as American tourist going, what's going on here? This is a strange place I found myself. Caitlin Dever, she's not playing an American, she's playing an Australian person, but why isn't an Australian actress playing that role?
This is very surprising coming from you. And I'll tell you why. Because the example that you cite that the Australian industry...
Because I'm always going on that we need more and more Americans playing Australians on screen.
No, because the example that you cite with regards to back in the past we needed an American or a British star to secure funding to make Australian films.
When we say we, obviously the financing needs it. I don't know that culturally we needed it, but yeah.
Regardless, yeah, but back then we did need it, yeah, to get the funding. Now we're in a similar space where organisations and platforms like Netflix or Amazon or the major streamers are now an international force. Now don't play specifically to certain countries, they are global. So does it matter that
yes,
in a production terms, you can come to Australia, you can use an entire production team. This is made by Seesaw Films, and the whole cast is full of recognisable Australian actors, and crew were employed to make this show. But in the lead, you have an American actress who, well, you know, she's not a Emma Stone. She's not sort of drawing huge dollars.
She's not bringing the eyeballs that like.
She's not bringing the eyeballs. So why is the casting of her as an actress, considering we've just talked about September 5, which casts Ben Chaplin in a key role, where, you know, British and Australians take over American roles all the time. What is the problem that an American takes over an Australian role?
Look, I mean, this is the thing. So I certainly appreciate that as an argument. Okay, like that's totally cool. But just talking explicitly about this Australian situation, we are part of a screen culture in Australia where we are talking at the moment with a lot of threat coming from overseas, where our free-to-air broadcasters don't have the money or inclination necessarily to spend on Australian drama in a way that they did in the past. Okay, so there's very few hours, I think it was 5 last year, 5 hours of Australian drama produced for Australia's commercial TV networks. You've got the ABC still producing a bit, but they're under budget constraints. You've got SBS producing, I don't know, maybe like 5 to 8 hours throughout the year. It wasn't a massive amount there either, but again, they've got some pretty serious budget constraints as well. Okay, basically it leaves it with the couple of streaming services in Australia. So Stan, to their credit, does a fairly good job at this. A lot of their money goes into co-productions with overseas, productions. So it's certainly things that they're producing, but they're not necessarily always Australian, from creative through to casting all the way through. But we'll put Stan to the side. But then you've basically got Amazon, Netflix, and I guess Paramount Plus, where they're regularly producing stuff in Australia, but are they making Australian programs really for Australia, or are they exporting them out to the rest of the world? Like, is the idea of this series, Apple Cider Vinegar, made for an Australian audience, or is it an Australian story that they're presenting for overseas markets? It's the second, like, quite clearly, but Netflix will argue it's the other way. And as we're on the cusp at the moment of a big political situation where there's an argument being made by the local industry that the government should be forcing quota points on international streaming service in Australia producing this stuff, that they should be producing so much Australian stuff. The question that has to be asked is, why are you producing it? Are you producing it to keep our local industry afloat, or are you doing it to make sure that Australian stories are still being told? And is it really an Australian story if it's a watered down version being made for an international market?
But
Okay,
is it an Australian story to start with? It happens to be set in Australia about an Australian person, but
I
it
think
deals with bigger internet-based, web-based, influencer-based themes that go around the world. We're not. This isn't the Slim Dusty story. This isn't Cool and Get a Gold. We're talking
Simon,
about
all
All
stories,
Banned from Snowy River.
stories are universal to a certain degree.
Yes.
Okay, but it's about the authenticity of the location that you're telling that story. So I watch a lot of overseas productions via Netflix, where I'll often watch it with dubbing on because, just whatever the situation is. I'll often have the subtitles running at the same time, but I usually have the dubbing on. Okay, which is often for the detriment because the quality of the voice acting is not necessarily always particularly great. But I'll watch things and they'll talk about, going to like the university, and like there's never a reference to specifically what university it is. To Apple Cider Vinegar's credit, there's a scene in episode 2 where they go to Wynnum in Brisbane.
Yes.
Okay,
I thought of you when that came up. Yep.
Yeah. Look, I live just a few suburbs away from Wynnum. There are some pretty rough areas of Wynnum. There's some pretty nice areas of Wynnum. I lived in an area a few suburbs over where things were, quite nice. But, I've never seen something in Wynnum before. I mentioned this in my newsletter during the week, but I used to play Wednesday night trivia. One of the teams that used to play against us quite regularly was called Stabbed in Wynnum. And that just makes me laugh every time. Love that. But that is cultural location specificity, which speaks to where the story's coming from. That sort of thing needs to be retained in our stories.
Wait a minute. What about Goodfellas? You're talking about cultural specificity, which is a terrible word to try to say at any time of the day.
You did all right there.
That is central to so many stories told in specific parts of the world with specific political and cultural influences that we understand a part of the storytelling. We don't understand what the writer or the director or the actors understand about that cultural specificity, but we do understand that it's integral to the look and feel of the story, as international audiences will when... I mean, I've seen the episode, so I know what you're talking about. When they go to Wynnum, there is enough spoken of amongst the characters and amongst Belle's sort of reluctance to go back there and visit her mum that we get it.
Okay, if we're going to use Goodfellas and Apple Cider Vinegar as the 2 points of reference here...
No, I'm saying from a cultural perspective.
No, but I'm saying, okay, the difference is that Goodfellas was produced within an American film financing industry, okay, at a time where I don't think anyone was concerned at all about the plight of American stories being told on screen. Okay, whereas...
You're drilling down on my example of Goodfellas. It's a broader point.
I'm just saying, this is two good examples. So we've got that taking place on that side. On the other hand here, we've got Apple Cider Vinegar, which is a series where, look, I went to the premiere for this and the, talents and executives from Netflix and everyone got on stage talking about how it's really important to tell Australian stories and really talking about the purity as to what we're talking about here. We want to see this take place, okay? But, okay, they're two different situations. So we're actually in a position where we need to really think actively about what are the stories we're telling and who are the storytellers that are bringing Australian stories to screen versus what we saw in Goodfellas, which is a film made in an industry which is well and truly set up where there's no concern about outside influence at this point. We need to be thinking about this and active in that conversation. And yes, I think Caitlin Dever does a great Australian accent in this, but still, someone who's from Australia should probably also be able to do a great accent. Necessarily have the same star power as Caitlin Dever? Probably not, and it's not like Caitlin Dever's a huge star to begin with. But if we don't actually have Australian talent in these lead roles and build up our own local talent to be able to do this, we're never going to be able to take our talent to a global level. We're going to have to export our actors to work in American productions and become famous on their own terms. We'd kind of like to have our own local industry. And I don't think you get a strong industry by constantly undercutting it by bringing in American actors to portray Australians on screen.
Okay, that seems very left of centre, with all due respect coming from you. And on that...
This is very consistent with everything I've been talking about in terms of Australian funding and productions for years now, Simon. I don't understand why you think this is left outside of the expected.
Would you turn away a major cast or a major director injection into our economy just because you think they're telling an Australian story?
Okay, sorry, what does that actually mean? So...
when
you say would I turn away them from our economy? Like, I don't get what you're actually asking.
If a production is being set up here in Australia and the production is one based on an Australian cultural element or an Australian... See, that's the issue I have with, particularly with Apple Cider Vinegar. It is such a universal story and was taking place in various countries around the world at the time when the internet was wild. As you said in your review, that it was the wild west of the internet stage. Instagram was only just coming along. This speaks to a universal problem that was happening at the time. It surprises me that you'd lay at Netflix's doorstep,
Simon, if
the role that the role they should play in building Australian film industry culture.
If the movie was about a couple who lost a child during childbirth, and it was about the emotional fallout of that, okay, but it's featuring two Australians and set in Melbourne, okay, that's a universal story that can be told anywhere. Just because it's about social media and people have social media in other countries as well, I don't think is necessarily a sign that it's a universal story.
I don't know what paradigms you would draw to argue that point on a production by production basis.
Well, I mean, I don't know what your argument is on that same point. Yeah, just generally.
Okay.
I just think it's a bit of a silly argument. But I'm just saying...
Not silly, relevant in terms of forwarding the industry, but it's certainly not silly.
We have a local industry right now that is struggling to find a voice and funding and a industry that can support it. We need to talk about these as big grown-ups and actually sort of think, hey, look, if we're telling Australian stories, it should be Australian people telling it.
5 networks to do that. Why is that for the Netflix?
Simon, but this is the thing. This is exactly the problem. As I said, the commercial networks are not funding this sort of stuff anymore because they don't have the money to, or purport not to have the money to. That's an entirely different conversation. I'm very happy to have that another point because I think that's kind of BS. Okay, Australian networks aren't doing it. The industry conversation is coming down to the fact that these international services should be producing Australian stories and mandated by the law to do that. Okay, and my argument has always been that no, we shouldn't be relying on international services to do this because if we want to have a industry which is telling Australian stories from a authentic perspective, where we're actually telling stories about Australia, then it probably actually needs to come from Australians and from our local industry. How do we support that and not just force these overseas streamers to be funding that for us because we won't get the most pure of intent?
Did you see The Royal Hotel with Julia Garner?
No, I didn't.
So that's an American actress coming out to tell a story that deals with outback misogyny and pub culture. That can only be told in Australia, but it tells the story using international, travelling backpackers to get that point across.
No glove fits all hands. I think we learned that with OJ. No glove fits all hands. You can pull out all the examples you want sort of here and there, but I think that there's a very... crucial conversation we need to have at this very specific point. And there was nothing that we had from this perspective that Caitlin Dever brought to it that a local actor couldn't have. Okay, as I said, I think she's very good in it, but at the same time, this is maybe just the poster child of, hey, look, let's have a serious conversation about this right now. Let's not just make excuses for it and just allow overseas streaming services to tell our stories. Because I don't think we get the most pure response out of that. But, if you do you fight for the big international, corporations. I'll be here supporting the little man with my 4 and 20 pie, and I'm going to crack my overseas-owned Foster's beer right now.
That's exactly right. All right, which I think you should ask me the question now so that we can move this podcast forward.
God, I wish we could. Simon, what else have you been watching?
Presence is in cinemas as we speak. This is the new film from one Steven Soderbergh and writer David Koepp. How did you pronounce it?
Koepp.
Okay.
Yeah, when we talked about this pre-podcast, I'm like, Simon, it's Koepp. Keep saying Koepp, and you've gone off reservation.
He has... I don't know if you can. He wrote Jurassic Park. So there's some big talent in this very small film, and it is a very small film.
He also wrote the new Jurassic Park, which, did you see the trailer for that during the week?
Boy.
My God, is that sleep-inducing?
It looked terrible, didn't it? I
don't think it looks terrible. I just think it looks really dull.
It looks dull. It also came in the wake of the Fantastic Four trailer, which I really loved. So, yes, it was an interesting week for trailers. Few dropped this week. Yeah, I thought the new Jurassic World Rebirth, awkward title too. But directed by Gareth Edwards, so there's a bit of hope there.
At least it wasn't called Afterbirth or something.
Yuck. Or Presence, which is the film we're talking about now. It is the story of told entirely from the point of view, literally the first person point of view, or first spirit point of view, of a ghost who's walking through this suburban house, and how she intermingles with the life of a family of 2 teenagers and the parents who come to live in the house. The suburb that they've moved into is going through a bit of a dark patch. There's been deaths recently that may or may not be drug overdoses. What we learn from this is that a good idea doesn't make a great movie. The first half of this, when the ghost is sort of moving around amongst the family members and looking at family members from closets, and there's one terrific scene where the ghost apparently knocks a shelf down and then gives a little puff of wind that blows the teenage girl's hairs up. That was truly chilling. That happens at about the halfway point of this. Then they try to convolute a believable plot out of it, and I just found myself picking apart the nonsense that was going on the screen before me. Terrific looking film. Its director of photography is Peter Andrews, which is also Steven Soderbergh. He just uses that name when he shoots his own films.
So Simon, I know, and I think you might know him as well, a real guy named Peter Andrews.
Yes.
Are you saying that's not Steven Soderbergh? Because I've had a number of conversations with that guy, and now I just don't know what I believe.
He claims to be Peter Andrews. He's clearly Steven Soderbergh, but yes. So I know you watched this film, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Did you find this as unconvincing in its payout as I did?
I actually kind of like the ending of it. I mean, I don't know about the coda necessarily right at the end. I like the third act generally worked for me pretty well. I really like this movie. Wow. It's a tidy, I think it's like 89 minutes, is that right?
Barely that. Yeah, I think it's a bit less, yep.
Yeah. It's a very, very low budget. How do you even talk about it? It feels a little bit slight for the most part. And even when you get to like the big action sequence, if you can call it that at the end, like it is, blink and you'll miss it. Like it is really, really slight in so many ways. But I just enjoyed that about it. I just kind of enjoyed the lo-fi nature of this and just had a great time watching it through. I didn't really find it to be necessarily unbelievable. It is a movie about a ghost. Generally tend to find it pretty unbelievable to begin with. Maybe I'm just not on the right sort of astral spectrum to be able to necessarily buy into it that clearly.
You're on the spectrum.
There was certainly nothing where I was like, oh, people don't behave that way. Like, it sort of seemed as though, it seemed pretty natural for the whole part.
I'm not going to give away spoilers, and I'm conscious not to do this. How the ghost can completely disrupt a room in a fit of rage, which happens at about the halfway point, but not play any greater role in the denouement of the denouement.
That's the first time we've used the word denouement on this podcast, and I can't believe it. It seems well overdue.
I even used the correct accent, which has surprised myself. So anyway, Presence is in cinemas very briefly, I think. This will end up on your streamer in no time. Like I say, it's Soderbergh having a bit of fun with the form, the whole first-person thing and the gliding steady cam. You're right, it's great to look at. It's a pretty-looking film, but I found it a fairly minor effort for everyone.
Yeah, this is the Steven Soderbergh that makes films like Kimmy, which we saw a couple of years ago on HBO.
Yeah.
That's like, right. Again, it's small, it's lo-fi, it's, quiet, enjoyable movie that'll probably stick with you a little bit, but it's certainly not going to be, one that you revisit all that many times.
And just very quickly, I have also been watching Amazon's big movie release of the week, You're Cordially Invited. This is the film
Simon, I'm sorry to hear this.
I know. Boy, I'm going to get cranky. I get cranky when films like this, which have so much talent and so much money behind them.
About unbelievable scenarios and characters.
This is just... And yeah, exactly right. And stumbling from one set piece to another with no bridging logic or any sort of believable narrative. I just started screwing down on this from the very first scenes in this movie, which were just awful. And the film continued to unbuckle itself in front of me. I'm not saying these movies weren't made in the past. They obviously were. But in the past, they would have starred Corbin Bernsen and Lisa Rinna, and they would have been made for some cheap cable network somewhere. Now you got Amazon throwing money at big talent like Will Ferrell and Reese Witherspoon to get them into stuff like this very quickly and onto our screens very quickly. It is a career low for Ferrell, and that's saying something. And Reese Witherspoon, who's grown into a very beautiful and very talented adult actress, needs to do something significant soon, otherwise her relevance will be all but gone. So I'm done with You're Cordially Invited.
Look, I've got a couple of things I want to argue with what you just said then, which was that, first of all, I think they were still making movies like this. In fact, some with Will Ferrell, well into the 2010s.
Sure. They've always existed.
When I think about this film, which is written and directed by Nicholas Stoller, one of the sort of Judd Apatow disciples who has one of those, when they talk about, I'll make one for you, one for me. Okay, it's basically the you is quality and the me is complete piles of shit. Okay, because he just alternates backwards and forwards. So this is a guy that's made some really fun, just very charming movies like Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Yes Man, which is slight, but I kind of enjoyed that one. But then there's awful things like Get Him to the Greek, The 5-Year Engagement, if you remember that awful.
Terrible movies.
Yeah. He made the Two Neighbours movies, or Bad Neighbours as we call them in Australia.
See, which I laughed.
Yeah, pretty good.
They were fun.
But between them, he made Sex Tape and Zoolander 2.
Wow, Zoolander 2.
You see what I'm saying? There's these he can't really settle one way or another. He's not middling.
He can't polish a turd. There are some directors who can somehow find laughs or somehow find some worth in the worst sort of premise or script or whatever, and Stoller can't do that. And his actors, there are moments in You're Cordially Invited where he literally just points the camera at Ferrell and say, hey, try and do something funny here. And Ferrell in particular comes out of this just looking, awful.
Yeah, no, I think they all come out at looking pretty bad. The problem is that Ferrell's character's asked to do a lot more sort of broad things than anyone else, so he just sort of sticks out that little bit more. But look, it's a bit of a struggle. I was probably more into the first 5 or 10 minutes of this movie than you were, obviously. Okay, but as soon as they reach the island and everything goes just a little bit, askew, the film just loses it entirely. Up until that point, you got some pretty sort of broad, silly moments, but I was kind of okay with it. I was prepared to be there for a broad, silly movie, and then it just became dumb, which, it's a fine line, but, the good films know how to balance it. Australian actress Geraldine Viswanathan.
Yep.
Yes, she is one of these sort of great actors who sort of cropped up a couple of years ago and just seems to sort of, I wouldn't say jump from film to film. It's jump from film, wait around for a year or two, then get another opportunity and then, just get forgotten. But she's always the best thing about anything that she's in. And she's absolutely the best thing in this movie.
She has to work hard though. Yeah, look, she has to work hard though. And you're right, she's watchable and brings a really spirited performance, but it's all still a long way below what she can do best.
Yeah, I posted something about how much I appreciate her in my newsletter during the week. And I just got all these responses from people saying that they'd seen her out and about around Sydney because she's, a local.
Yeah, she is.
So yeah, I'm now just keeping my eyes open because I figure it's a matter of time until I bump into her walking a dog.
What else have you been watching, Dan Barrett?
Well, sadly, one of the things I was watching was You're Cordially Invited. Oh my gosh. But also, just because they're debuting this week on 7+, so, first of all, this is kind of more just like a PSA to say, hey, these shows that you may have heard a fair bit about, you can see them, now. So 7+, the first one I want to talk about is a comedy called St. Denis. This is from the guy that created Superstore, if you watched that sitcom from a few years ago. His name's Justin Spitzer, I want to say. Basically, he was a writer on The Office. He got the chance to go off and produce his own series and he did Superstore. Superstore is quite good. It stars the aforementioned Ben Feldman. Well, I just lost his name. I said it earlier in this podcast. Ben Feldman.
Yes.
Who played Ginsberg on Mad Men, but he was the star in Superstore, or co-star.
And Ferrera, wasn't it? Wasn't it
America Ferrera was the
That's right,
the
yes.
lead. Yeah. Anyway, Superstore, for the most part, really, really good. That show goes off the rails when Justin Spitzer leaves the program. Okay, and then it ran for another 2 years and it was just awful after that. Okay, as is often the way with these shows. Okay, but since then he's gone off and made a number of other shows and all of them use the exact same spirit of The Office, okay, which is that they're filmed faux documentary style. And this is the latest one. So he did the, big box Reese House store and Superstore. He did one which is about the American auto industry and maybe even called Auto Industry. I forget the name of it. It's pretty forgettable. And then there's this one which is set in a hospital. And it's just kind of awful. So there's a box office pundit that I quite like reading named Scott Mendelsohn. And he had this really, really wise bit of commentary in one of his newsletters in the last week or two, where he was talking about how anytime that you try remaking a movie, okay, so think about Point Break, which is one of the examples he used. Okay, if you remake Point Break, it's going to be awful. But if you effectively remake Point Break, but call it something else, say Fast and the Furious, okay, and just change it up slightly, audiences will be there for it, okay? And I think that works absolutely in cinema, okay? But the reverse is true in TV shows where I think that if you just remake the same program, it looks exactly the same. Like, there's just something that's kind of lost in that week-to-week, like, churn of content that you need to be able to make. Like, you can't sort of keep things on the rail entirely, and so it starts to feel just like a rip-off and a pale imitation of something you've seen before. And I think it's because there's that expectation that you're coming back to it week after week. And so when you sit down and watch St. Dennis, and it's like, well, I've kind of already seen this as Superstore, as The Office, as... You know,
well, the impression that I get from it is
recreation.
Well,
okay.
yeah.
Also, like Abbott Elementary is probably another one that's also kind of
okay. So it's that handheld workplace documentary. The other feel I get from it is obviously Scrubs. So why am I watching this if I've watched 10 seasons of Scrubs?
Well, that's exactly it. Like, why are you watching this? It just feels like an imitation, and it doesn't work on TV. And when the characters here aren't really particularly fun, when the jokes aren't very good, when it just kind of feels like every movie and TV show we've seen from like a comedy perspective in the last like 10, 15 years, like it's just sort of almost unwatchable. And it is. I thought, you know what, I've watched the first episode, it's not good. I'll watch episode 10, which I did last night, and it doesn't improve across 10 episodes. It's the same flaccid, just, you know, nonsense. Which brings us to the hunting party, which is... During the week, Simon, I watched, and I'm sorry to do this, but it's the drinking game, you've got to, you know, go for this. I was watching an episode of Homicide: Life in the Street from about like 1990.
Here we go.
No, stick with me. 1997, 1998. It's an episode that's called Homicide.com. Okay, and in this story, it's something which I used to see at this era of American TV, like usually sort of police and, you know, profiler type TV shows. Okay, where there'd be somebody, and keep in mind it's like 1998. There's somebody who's streaming murders on the internet, and your heroes have to hunt the people down and try to stop it before there's a murder. Okay, so there's a ticking clock, and you know it's all going to happen, and there's lots of people routing to mainframes and, you know, checking code, and, you know, cops going around learning about the internet as, you know, it's a thing. Because we didn't know the internet back then.
No.
And look, it's been 27 years since this Homicide episode, for example. I've spent a lot of time on the internet since then. Not once have I ever seen a murder streamed live online. It just hasn't happened.
And you've gone deep and dark. I've seen your search history. I'm surprised you haven't.
Look, I mean, yeah, I'm not even going to go into some of the sort of gnarly places I've been, but I've never seen it happen. But it was just like a convention of that kind of thing. But when I was watching that, it just reminded me of this period in American TV where you saw things like Profiler and Millennium and like the sort of 10 or so cop dramas that were kind of a little bit between like a Law and Order and a like Profiler Millennium type thing. Okay, and all of them were just kind of doing these same sort of stories over and over again. And The Hunting Party, which has been released, feels like a throwback to one of those also run programs.
Is that a good or bad thing?
Well, this is the thing. Like, at the moment, I'm on a bit of a jag of watching a lot of stuff from the 80s through the 90s, which is kind of where broadcast TV kind of really came into its own, was producing some like really tight, interesting stuff. Not all necessarily amazing,
it's
but
a
like
knockout.
It's, well, no, I mean, let's not. I mean, also, I mean, that's technically like a British show from the 70s, but that's neither here nor there. So I've been on this jag where I've been kind of going for a bit of a nostalgic sort of throwback and appreciating storytelling sort of coming from that perspective. But this here, it just kind of felt like I was watching, instead of Millennium, I'm watching an episode of Profiler. Okay, it's a pretty young blonde lady who is 32 but commits the cardinal sin of every TV show like this, where she'll talk about these really lengthy, you know, what seems almost like decades old relationships it had with people. But it's like, well, actress playing this role, you're 32 years old. When you talk about, you know, I've spent years with this person, like, what was that, 3 years? Like, it just doesn't really make any sense. And in this, like, there's a reveal towards the end of the first episode, sorry, spoiler, that a girl that she rescued on a case that she'd been working on for years with this other guy, like, she took her in and adopted her. And when this girl was taken in, she would have been, I think, maybe sort of 8 to 12, I forget what it was, but she's like now like a late teenager. So like, this character's supposed to have been around for years and years at this point, but she's only 32. It's really frustrating. But The Hunting Part, it feels like a throwback to Millennium, but also there was a TV show with a really cool premise in the very late 90s called Brimstone. And the idea of this one was there was a guy who was sent to hell because he'd killed his wife. He'd killed the man that had killed his wife. Okay, but hell's had a escape of, you know, demons, and so he's sent back to Earth to hunt down all these demons. And so episode after episode, he's hunting down one of these demons to, you know, bring them back to hell. This is almost the exact same program, which sort of posits the idea that what if the American law enforcement system ended up capturing a whole bunch of serial killers, and instead of just imprisoning them around the place, imprisoned them all into one location so they could use this location to learn what makes a serial killer and try to phase out serial killers over time. But what happens when someone tries to break out a whole bunch of serial killers at once, and there's only one blonde lady that can go, teamed up with, generic white guy, to go and retrieve all these serial killers. And that's what this program is. It's just nonsense.
She is pretty, though. Melissa Roxburgh.
Yeah, which I don't really know from anything, but...
No, well, I wondered if she was daughter of Richard, but no, she's a Canadian actress. Okay, well, so there's 2 shows I don't have to watch.
No, please don't.
Dennis and the Hunting Party, which, please, God, let it bring it to the end of this episode. This has gone on longer than religion. You can find out all things screen watching at our Facebook page, at Screen Watching Podcast, on Threads and YouTube at Screen Watching. Do drop us an email at screenwatchingpodcast@gmail.com. When I'm not doing this, usually I do stuff on Screen Space, but over the next little while, certainly at the end of next week, as this goes to where, February 21 to 23, I'll be down in Melbourne hosting my little Melbourne Science Fiction Film Festival screenings at the home of good science fiction film festival screening, Cinema Nova, February 21 to 23. So if you're in the Melbourne, southern capital of Melbourne, please come along and say hi. Dan, what do you do when you're not doing this?
Do you have any movie highlights? Give me 2 highlights.
Boy, we have a terrific alien abduction drama about a young man who knows he's going through night terrors and having visitations in the night. It's called Abductee. It's a little American indie film, and it's a terrific story. And we are screening for the first time in a long time. It's actually the 45th anniversary screening of Chomps. Now, if your heart just skipped a beat, you will be thinking of Valerie Bertinelli and Wesley Ewer as the inventor of a canine home mechanized protection system, or Chomps, a robot dog, and much shenanigans and slapstick ensues. So we get all the big films at the Melbourne Science Fiction Film Festival.
Sorry, just to verify, these films played at the Sydney Science Fiction Film Festival late last year, is that right?
One did, Chomps did. Abductee is an Australian premiere. Our opening night film is UFO Sweden, which I love and I'm a huge fan of, and it did play in Sydney, and it's opening our Melbourne screenings.
Yeah, I saw some films from Sweden in the 70s. They were pretty good as well.
Oh boy.
Yeah, hello. Folks, if you want to track down my musings, check out alwaysbewatching.com. It's a website, it's a newsletter, it's a way of life, frankly. It's got all the stories you need from the, TV world, a little bit of streaming, a little bit of movies, occasionally video games and virtual reality and all sorts of stuff. If it's plugged into your eyeball, I talk about it in the newsletter.
And if you want to hear more of our rantings, what the hell's the matter with you? Listen to Best Movie Year, our other podcast in which we are dissecting the movies of 1987 to determine if that year was in fact the best movie year ever. We go straight from recording this episode of Screen Watching into recording an episode about the Whoopi Goldberg film Burglar, and I'm keen to see how much we love that little film. So...
I think I know. Anyway, folks, sit down. That's going to be a very fun chat. Folks, this has been Screen Watching. We'll be back next week with a shorter podcast. We'll see you then.